are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. We're going to talk about frauds and forgeries in the ancient world and throughout history. I mean, we're still seeing stuff like this happen today, and you can learn a thing or two, I'm sure, from this discussion. My good friend, Steven Sorensen, he has dived deep into this idea of people writing forgeries and how do we know if something might be authentic or not. And you're really interested in these ideas. So I want everyone to know, if you're interested in checking out after hearing this content, you say, you know what, I like what this guy said. Let me go find out more. He talks about chronology and such. You can check his website out. It's in the description. And of course, here he's talking about literary fraud. I was just reading this before we did the recording. So, Steven, welcome to MythVision Podcast, man.
Derek, thanks for having me on. I'm honored to be here. And despite your perception of me doing a deep dive, I feel like I'm still just chiseling away at the tip of the iceberg right now.
Well, I think everybody, we have fragmentary evidence. Stuff's not as black and white and as clear as we'd like it. We wish we had the fingerprints and the DNA and the studies that we now look at things to have for antiquity. But it's not the same. And I think you're going to teach us a lot. So if you don't mind, go ahead and dive us into the 8th ring of hell, if you don't.
Yeah.
For our audience.
Yeah. So this is going to be a 2-part presentation. This is the first part, and I'll be talking about more generally fraud, but I will focus in on literary fraud later on. Basically, I'm going to talk about the 8th circle of hell, which is where Dante has said that the fraudsters are located, where all the falsifiers have been put into because they have knowingly deceived other people. They've deceived with intent. So that is a criminal action. But maybe it's not, depending on what kind of culture you come from. Sometimes it's considered playful fun, like a prank or something. And so there's quite a bit of a discussion here. So I'm going to talk about the forgery culture. What is forgery, fraud? And then I'm going to, in the end of this, I'll give you some recommended reading. In the second part, I'll talk about some definitions, which is kind of a really interesting part. There's so many different views on what forgery is. One man's forgery is another man's authentic record. And so when you're going in to look into these fields of scholarship, knowing what people are talking about is really important. And as you'll find, some people don't define their terms very well. And so you're kind of left to try and figure it out for yourself since they don't do that. So
tell us some of the scholars, how they understand what a forgery or you know what I mean? Like how different people interpret it and then what you find it to be.
Oh, I will get into that in part 2. So you're going to have to stay tuned. But first, we're going to get into the 8th circle of hell. So Derek showed you, those were my notes that I'm going to kind of read off of and then kind of riff on. So this is what I've written. Falsifiers, also known as fraudsters, are placed in the lowest level of the 8th circle of hell in Dante's Inferno, for they knowingly deceive. Fraud is committed when a party intentionally deceives another party here being defined as a person or a group of persons. Fraud comes in many forms and plays a serious role in historical studies, which is my main interest in it. I'll talk about kind of how fraud is approached in society today later on. So in Canto 17 of Dante's Inferno, Dante and Virgil are brought to the 8th circle of hell by Geryon, a chimerical beast symbolic of fraud. And so in this writing, fraud is made into this beast. It represents it, and it brings Dante and Virgil from the 7th circle, or from the previous ring to the lowest ring in the 8th circle. This is not to be confused with the Geryon that was slain by Hercules. This is a winged serpent with the paws of a lion and the tail of a scorpion and the face of a kind, gracious, and just man. So this creature, looking kind of like a cousin to the manticore, does well in portraying the life and anatomy of fraud. Imagine, if you will, that you're walking through the dark corridors of historical scholarship when a trustworthy and inviting face emerges from the shadows. As you approach this welcoming visitor, it steps out from the fog to reveal a body composed of potentially dangerous animals. Fraud is like snakes, lions, and scorpions in the sense that it won't always hurt you, but it has the potential to. and knowledge of these animals is important when observing and interacting with them. Some snakes are harmless, just like fraud, but others can deliver enough venom to kill 100 people in a single bite. Lions and scorpions are similar. They can be deadly, but not always so. Knowing where they live and how they hunt can help you prevent ever becoming their prey. The same goes for fraud. Knowing where and how fraud thrives can allow you to avoid becoming a victim and allow you to help others do the same. However, even though the idea of safety is attractive, it's to be noted that we all have our limitations and we can all be taken in by deception given the proper circumstances. Unidentified fraud posing as historical evidence is a problem for historical studies because it distorts our perception of the past and it acts as a mirage of things that we think happened. While fraud has long been studied, it has mostly been studied in relation to economic activity, such as credit card fraud, or in relation to political activity, for example, voting fraud. Lesser so, these studies have been applied to art, mostly for the purposes of valuation, which is kind of a subgenre of economic activity. And even lesser than that, they've been applied to historical studies, which is where my main interest is. Now, fraudulent activity is by no means absent from the professional world at large. There are many people alive today who possess the motives, the means, and the opportunities to commit the type of fraud that is especially problematic for historians, and they do commit it. Oscar White Muscarella is an archaeologist who worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for about 45 years from 1964 to 2009. From what I know about him, I think he's a great scholar who's worthy of some attention. In 2016, about 5 years ago now, Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Archaeology and History, Daniel T. Potts, complimented Oscar by saying that Muscarella has been a vocal and tireless champion of ethics and the exposure of criminal and unethical behavior on the part of collectors and museums for decades. And more than any other scholar, he has underscored the damage inflicted upon scholarship by the naive incorporation of unexcavated artifacts alongside excavated ones in studies that seek to elucidate the past. Now, Oscar's life is fascinating, but I don't have the time to go into the depths of his background, education, activism, scandals, and censorship. I do have an article up on my website titled Oscar White Muscarella that talks about all that for anyone interested in learning more. To help describe, so Oscar in his book, The Lie Became Great, gave 25 stories or anecdotes about what he calls the forgery culture. And this is the culture in which fraud thrives, specifically forgery. So they serve to give an impression of the range of what he calls the forgery culture. And these are only a handful of examples that he says that he has while working over 40 some years in the field. So while his book and these stories are centered mainly around the art world, I think it would be interesting and useful to compile a collection of similar anecdotes for the presence of the forgery culture in the literary world. Now, I have an article on my website titled The Ecosystem of Forgery, in which I kind of summarize some of these things that he talks about, and I'm going to read some parts from that. So this is how Oscar describes the forgery culture. He says it's stratified and multifaceted. It has a kinship system, a hierarchical structure, systems of gift exchange, laws, a coded language, judges and juries, usually the same, and a police force. Its inhabitants include professors, curators, scientists, museum officials and trustees, dealers, smugglers, auction house employees, collectors, and forgers. In imperial culture, it colonizes other, more legitimate cultures, drawing into its realm scholars, students, and the general public. It controls an extensive physical geography, but possesses no moral geography. An appreciation of the spirit of its deeds suggests that many who participate in the culture's activities function as a fifth column in the archaeological domain. Individuals function in this capacity willingly or as fellow travelers because of the prestige, power, and financial support granted, some out of fear, for example, losing one's job or someone's affection and support. Others are more innocent or ignorant, not realizing they perform an important task that helps the culture to thrive. And so here we have kind of the picture of basically everybody, any position that you're in, you have the potential to contribute to this scholarship, even if it's out of sheer ignorance, contributing to the forgery culture, not knowing that it exists or denying that it exists. Forgeries are as old as time itself, as old as human creation goes, it's been noted quite a bit. So here I'm going to run through some of these anecdotes, and it'll help give you kind of a sense of what the forgery culture is. And some of this stuff is kind of maybe a no-brainer, but I think it's important to go over just for anybody that's really never looked into this. And there's some people that can get to their historical PhDs and they've spent very little time looking into fraud and forgery. So this is something I've found really fascinating. The first story he gave was about how the administration of a museum made an attempt to prevent the publication of an article that argued an object, not even in their possession, was a forgery. It belonged to someone who donated money and items to their museum. Naturally, they didn't want to upset this donor, and so they made an attempt to suppress the press for this reason. In this way, they're trying not to damage the reputation of a donor, because if the donor is associated with this forged item, they won't be donating to that museum anymore, even though it's not in their possession. It just happened to be, I think, one of the members of the museum doing that. Next, Oscar mentioned that he was aware of numerous museums that accepted donated forgeries, knowing that they were forgeries. The knowledge of these items being forgeries is sometimes kept quiet from scholars and the public. The forgeries also provide tax deductions, and they pose as financial duplicates of the real items, thereby exploiting the tax system. And this one is interesting. And also, I will mention that I've never heard any of this discussed on any podcasts or anywhere else. I've only seen it in the book, and I've seen the book mentioned other places, but I've never heard these actually presented to the public aside from the book. But this is museums keeping the knowledge of forgeries on the low. Means that scholars and the public, but specifically scholars, if they're writing research papers and they think that they're working with an authentic item and the knowledge of it being a forgery is concealed from them, they will write on a forgery thinking it's authentic, and that will get put out into the public just so that, and the reason they don't know that it's fake is because the museum wanted to keep that on the down low. And even more severe, I think, for economic reasons, is the duplicate items, these financial loopholes where people can forge an item and sell it as an authentic piece for who knows any amount of money, $40,000 or something, and then they can get tax deductions for that because they've bought a authentic piece of art, even though the museum knows that it's not authentic. The next story was about the less common situation where the museum director keeps forgeries on display to assert power, basically pissing on the fire hydrant to show that he's the one in control. This is done as an attempt to flex their unquestionable authority in case there's any dissidence or insubordination amongst his colleagues in the museum. The museum director can keep forgeries up without telling the public to show that it's his collection and he gets to choose what goes in it. The fourth story was about the role that loyalty plays in the forgery culture. A curator's loyalty to their hirers, their institutions, or the object's owner is one reason that forgeries are kept on display. They might lose funding if any of these relations are damaged, and hence forgeries remain on display, unknown to be such to the public. Fifth was about how some collections would be so severely impacted by the removal of their forgeries that the departments and jobs would have to be eliminated, since removing the forgeries from some collections would lessen their volume by over half in some cases. So some collections would just be almost completely obliterated to the point that it would be difficult for them to justify keeping the department up. Another one, this one I found to be kind of interesting, is sixth, is that the private notes are sometimes kept on known forgeries. So one or all of the following are common. No examinations are allowed. You're not allowed to look over the object. The correct age of the object is not to be announced, and no mention of it being a forgery is allowed. And so people cannot examine it. They're not allowed to know the age, and this is kept in notes for the staff to look at, but never to be exposed to the people. This type of safeguard allows the forgery to survive, at least for those not in on the secret. Some people do know it's a forgery, but they keep the charade up. Again, sometimes curators will flex their power by refusing non-destructive testing of objects suspected of being forgeries. So this is kind of in the same vein as the previous anecdote, is that even if there's methods of testing that are not destructive, the curator will not allow it in case it turns out that it's actually a fake. And so they're denied out of fear. There's various reasons for this, such as the protection of their reputation or that of someone they know.
If I may poke in here, I'd like to ask, because my critical mind would like to be like, okay, how do we know what you're saying about them like trying to secretly hold this? I'm not ruling it out as it's not possible. Sure. I say that as I'll leave some scholars' names unnamed. But they were writing on material that they knew wasn't true. I mean, they spent years writing on this material, waiting to release that to the public, knowing something about the material. And is there any evidence, though, in particular that you're aware of where we know what you just said, that would be considered a conspiracy to me? And I don't mean it in the derogatory terms of like flat earth or something. I'm saying like there's a real conspiracy to conceal and hide what this really is for the purposes of, let's get more attention. Let's keep the hype going. People like to believe in things and they like controversy. So I don't say it's not possible. I'm just saying, do we have any evidence that actually has happened? Is there a case that you can give me where you're like, we know that this happened because this guy finally came out and said, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah. So you're asking examples of these anecdotes. The one case that comes straight to mind is the forgery duo. Both their names were John. I think one of them was John Wyatt, but one of them worked in the art museum and the other one was forging the paintings. And one of the guy that worked at the museum, he was forging the provenance of these paintings. And so while one guy he's painting up the painting and the other guy is busy working on the provenance, which is the history of the item. And so you have this guy working in the museum, getting the paintings into the museum, and this is a pretty well-known case. I think maybe these are one of the guys that got a TV show on it. There's some forgers today that have gotten TV shows. They teach others how to do forgeries now. It's a real money-making industry, but that would be one example, potentially. I think of the curator who's walking through his collection and he sees a painting that he's never seen before, and he's like, has this always been here? And John is like, of course it has. I've got the provenance right here. It's from the 40s. It's been in our collection since the 60s, but it's a lie from him. So that's one off the top of my head. From what I've read about Muscarello, though, he doesn't seem like the type that would tell a lie for just any reason. I don't think that he would. That's why I included that voucher from the other professor. And if he is lying, then either that professor was taken in or they're part of a conspiracy to try and say that there's other conspiracies going on. Which I don't think that conspiracies are too far-fetched. People definitely conspire almost every single day against other people.
No, I'm with you. And I must say that as someone who I am seriously, because conspiracies fly around so much, though, I am extremely skeptical of conspiracies. It's gotten so bad that there's, they say, oh, you can learn anything because the internet, it's all this information. I would also argue there's so much misinformation that to sift through and know what is and what isn't and what positions are accurate and which aren't is a very difficult task in modern world, with everyone floating ideas out there and everyone saying they're right about something. So I'm with you. I'm also very skeptical, because the problem we have then, and this comes down to like what Dr. Price says. I'll give you one analogy. You'll get what I'm saying. Can we trust the Pauline epistles? And he's like, well, what he means is like, can we trust when they were written, and are they actually pre-70 authentic 40s, 50s Pauline letters to some degree? Of course, they've been probably tampered with since, in terms of what we actually get of them by the late second century, mid second century. But the point is, he's saying, do we know that those are that? And if we break that, he says all of scholarship's positions on early Christianity, the start of this thing, it's destroyed. Like, now they have to reevaluate what is and what isn't. So there's that difficulty. Part of me is like skeptical of being so cautious and saying this is what's going on, that can we trust anything anyone's saying about anything at that point? Like, how do we know the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1940s were real? How do we know that? How do we know the Nag Hammadi library that Elaine Pagels recently was talking about, and we spent all this time, I traveled to Colorado to record. How do we know that the Nag Hammadi library is true, especially when its provenance isn't as pretty as we'd like it to be? Same thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I got a quote up on my Instagram about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were talking recently about the just terrible state of provenance. And basically, if the head honcho said it was from Cave 3, it's from Cave 3. All right, that's where it came from.
Right.
No other need to ask any questions or probe any further. You know, the guy said so. We got to take his word for it. But I'm in the same boat. I'm quite skeptical. I wonder if he did make any of these stories up. But with 40 years in the museum industry, the stuff that he's been through, like, he really, from the stories that I've read about him, he really does seem to be a champion of ethics and holding people accountable. He almost lost his job a bunch of times at the Met, and it ended up with New York State in a court of law designating him to no longer be questioned about his ability to perform his functions at his job, because his coworkers were trying to get him fired so many different times that the judge finally said, look, you guys got to stop. This guy's competent. He knows what he's talking about. We're keeping him in the museum. And they ended up sliding him by upgrading his position from curator to, I think, senior research fellowship, which from what I've heard, Oscar called it a Mickey Mouse title, kind of a goofy title that they just wanted to get rid of him. They didn't want him curating anymore. He was in charge of the ancient Near Eastern art.
Is he still
section.
around today?
I think he is, but he's up there. I think he's in his 80s or 90s now.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So,
see, his memory wouldn't be the best right now, but
I thought about,
I'm sorry I interrupted you the flow, but
no,
I had to.
Interrupt me whenever you want.
You're reading a lot of material, and I hope anyone who's watched this far is bearing with us here, because there's a lot of material being read, and I like dialogue. I like conversation, letting you come out, because it's more showing your personality. But nonetheless, what he's reading, you can go down in the description. You should read it for yourself. I really enjoy this. I mean, forgery is a real thing to consider. And where I stand is I have this strange place, Stephen, where I want to have more. I wonder if skeptics are being too skeptical. And sometimes when we do that, I feel like we might be saying, oh, we don't trust this information, or, oh, this might be an interpolation, or this, that. And it may not be. And what that does is radically change what you're allowing as evidence to kind of change your perception about whatever the theology, whatever it might be, if we're talking Bible or whatever, or history or whatever. If we're so skeptical, we don't trust anything, we have no bearings on anything. I wonder if we're going too far. And, you know, how much trust can we have in humans when we know they're fabricating stuff? But at the same time, what are they just making fabrications because there's no real authentic, or is there really authentic here and someone's fabricating based off of a potential authentic origin of something? And it's such an interesting rabbit hole. You know what I'm talking about, but it's
What you're
still
talking about, I cover in part 2 with the semantics.
Okay.
I get pretty deep into that, and
Well, I'm sorry.
I appreciate it. Interrupt me whenever you want. I like the dialogue too. I set up these notes just so that I would have something to say when the dialogue is drawn on a bit.
Right.
And like you said, if you put the link in the description, I have all my notes up. I have citations. For most of my citations, I have the work and the page numbers that I get the specific parts from. So it's really easy to fact check me. I prefer people to look into it and not just take my word for it. I try to represent these scholars as accurately as I can. To my knowledge, I have represented them as accurately as I can. So I'm just going to skip to the very end of the bit about these anecdotes, but because it's on the concept of conspiracy, he says that an archaeological club made up of university professors all agreed that buying forgeries was better than buying items that had been plundered, and also that they shouldn't inform collectors and museums when they are considering purchasing or have purchased forgeries. And this group effort strengthens the forgery culture and harms scholarship, where they're getting together and conspiring to they've agreed that buying forgeries is better than buying plundered items, which I'm not sure why they would agree on that. I would think that even because plundering is illegal looting, it's when an archaeological site's been discovered, it gets plundered, and these items make their way onto the market. And they could be authentic, they could be fakes. But so, yeah, that's a bunch of professors got together to do that, according to Oscar. So if you want to read the other anecdotes, I got them all summarized there. Otherwise, you'll have to pick up the book to read it from Oscar himself. Before I do continue, I wanted to mention, when we're talking about forgeries, for the definition I use is something created with the intent to deceive someone else forever, indefinitely. You don't want it to be exposed. You want it to continually deceive. But that doesn't mean, now when we're talking about literary forgery, it doesn't mean that it's fake. You could have a forged document that has all correct historical information if you're saying that it's the original document, though. Say if you have somebody's will, it could be a copy of that will. This is what Michelangelo did with paintings, is that he would take the painting, the original, he would make a copy of it, and then he would give the copy back to the person that lent him the painting. And so it contains the same exact information. It's just he's keeping the original, and he's telling the people that he's given them the original. And so with a forged Pauline epistle, you could have the original words, but they're copies. It's not the original document. But if you said it was, then that's what it would be, is the forgery. So forgery is kind of a tricky subject sometimes. I think mostly people use it to talk about false information in literary studies, where people have inserted that. But I'll talk about that more in part 2. So with some of these short stories, we can get a glimpse of the forgery culture in the art world. Common are the fears of harming reputations, and common are the attempts to suppress scholarship. Large efforts have been made to minimize the scope of fraudulent activity, but it has thrived throughout the centuries, and it still thrives today. Oscar presented the results of reports estimating how many forgeries are in existence. He mentioned Hall 1990, which reported that 600 objects each year are determined to be forgeries at Oxford University. Lowe 1993 estimated half of the Marlick-like vessels on the market are forgeries, so 50%. A powerhouse among the world's largest brokers of fine and decorative art, jewelry, and collectibles, Sotheby, reports about half of the objects brought to them are forgeries. He tops it off with Norwick 1993, which reported that about 25,000 pre-Columbian art forgeries enter the market annually, which is just a massive amount of forgeries. 25,000. That is an incredible amount of art that is fake. Now, even Oscar's enemy, the once director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Thomas Hoving, apparently wasn't shy about the number of fakes in existence. In 1996, Thomas reported that out of some 50,000 works he had examined over the course of 15 years, 40 or more of them were forgeries, or at the least questionable. That's over 20,000 forged objects that moved through the Met. And I think he had even said later on that it was upwards towards 50. So that's another 25,000 fake items. It's basically a 50-50 shot that when you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you're looking at something that's real or fake. As for the literary field, and traveling back in time a bit, Anthony Grafton's reported that an estimated 66% of all documents that were given to the clergy prior to 1100 were fakes, which is, 2 out of 3 you get prior to 1100 were false documents. So there's really no shortage of fakes in the world, and all the major collections possess them.